Hello, and welcome back to another episode of The Conversation. I am your co-host, Onjalé Scott Price, and I am joined by the wonderful, fantastic, honorable Reverend Will Mebane. I love hanging out with this guy. We are so excited that you are joining us for another episode of The Conversation. We have a wonderful program scheduled today and very excited about our guests and very excited to be in studio once again. So let's get started. Our first question for today is, what is internalized racism and what causes it? I think it's going to spark a really interesting conversation. So let's go to our people on the street and see what they had to say about what is internalized racism and what causes it.
I think internalized racism has to do with people experiencing assaults that are racist, whether it's verbal or imagery, movies, films that trigger the memories or their own experiences in life. And this can be a continuing process, so that, for example, in terms of the Holocaust, when you see imagery and footage on TV of Holocaust survivors and victims, it really triggers depression, sadness, fear, that can make these episodes continue to be alive in your own memory and in your own consciousness.
So we heard from Sandra Faimain-Silva about what is internalized racism and what causes it. And I think I may have a slightly different take than what I think Sandy had on that one. But
interesting, because I had a similar reaction.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation. But before I begin with some of my thoughts, I'd like to introduce our guests. We have Dr. Alex Pieterse, an associate professor of counseling psychology in the Department of Counseling, Educational, and Development Psychology at Boston College. And thank you so much for making the trip down here, and we're excited to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely.
Happy to be here.
Great. So I'd like to start with you and either what you would like to respond to Sandy and her thoughts on internalized racism, or if you have different thoughts about the question.
Okay. First of all, it's a very important question. It has lots of implications, even for psychological health. The first thought that comes to mind is actually a quotation that I put on the front of my dissertation, which is a quotation from Stephen Biko, who has some relevance to me, being someone from South Africa. And Biko being the champion of black consciousness in South Africa, had a really interesting quote, which simply was, the greatest tool in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Which simply is, if we start to see ourselves in the same light as the people who are oppressing us, and then in some sense they've won the battle. Oh, yeah. We internalize that sense of inferiority. So that's what came to mind when I heard the question.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. As I took the question a little bit differently and thinking about internalized racism as literally internalizing the systems of racism and that oppression. So I look forward to continuing to hear your thoughts on that. But I'd like to welcome Dr. Donna Jackson, old friend of mine, clinical psychologist with a private practice here.
She can't be that old because you're not that old. Come on.
Old-ish friend of mine. I have new friend here and an old friend, so old-ish friend of mine. A clinical psychologist with private practice here in Falmouth. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Glad I'm here on live taping.
Yeah, because the last time we had you, we were still on Zoom. So it's nice to be able to do this in person now.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask you if you have any comments on what Sandy said, or if you have other thoughts on what internalized racism is and what causes it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things Sandy said was she wasn't sure there was much you could do about it. I found that a little disheartening, and that you could go to therapy or have a stiff upper lip is what I remember. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know if either of those options are really the best route to go. I think there's a lot of things we can hopefully do about it, but I think the conversation we're about to have and kind of take this jumping off point is really how do we start to have a conversation? Because one of the things I was more dismayed by was when I went to do a little looking around about the coverage on the whole implication of policing and another death of a young black man, there wasn't as much coverage as I thought. There wasn't as much conversation, and that was concerning to me.
Yeah.
Is why are we not talking about it more? So I'm really glad that you're bringing it here.
Thanks. Yeah, that's what we aim to do, is bring out those conversations that may be sometimes difficult to have, but are really important. So let me ask my trusty co-pilot over here, Reverend Will, what do you think?
Well, a couple things. So, Donna, if I can refer to you that way, your comment about police brutality, or what I call police lynching of young African American women and men, and is really what kind of prompted us to have this this conversation as a show topic. It was just after the beating and killing of the young man in Memphis, Tyre Nichols, I think was his name. And one of the things that happened was people seemed to be shocked that the police officers engaged in that act were black.
Yeah.
Right? And people were kind of, oh, they were black. So they're like, okay, well, why would that be surprising? I mean, I can understand maybe why it would be surprising to folks. And it reminded me, when I think about internalized racism, it's more along the lines of what you, Alex, if I may, would said. It's when you begin as a person that's oppressed to believe what's being said about you, right? You began to believe that you're not worthy, right? That you are, if you're black, that you are, I am lazy, or if people accuse you of that, or make other stereotypical comments about you and accusations towards you, you begin to believe that, and so you begin to operate out of that. That's how you begin to function. And so that was my understanding of internalized racism.
Yeah.
And when I think about those police officers, those black police officers that beat, may you rest in peace, Tyre Nichols like that. And since then, we've had another case in Chesterfield, Virginia, I think it is, where there were police officers and care professionals in I think, psychiatric center or something, that 12 of them or 14 of them were on top of this black male who ended up dying from asphyxiation, from being smothered to death, right? And most of those were black folks and brown folks. So I was like, okay, all right. So yeah, that was my thinking. It's I love Sandy. I think she's terrific. We've had her on the show several times, but I had a little different take. It sounds like you did also.
Yeah, and I think that's why we have this show, right? Is to hear what people have to say about these different topics and discuss them. And I immediately, when I think about internalized racism, I think about my own upbringing and childhood. And when I was in high school, I spent a lot of time with my best friend's family, and I loved them dearly. They were wonderful to me. The mother was Mexican and the father was white, and they had a very different experience than I did growing up. And I recall, certain comments being made like, oh, you're not really black, and being like us is better because we we have this and that. And at some point I don't necessarily fault them. That's what they knew, and they just didn't have any other experiences. But it took a long time for me to unlearn some of that. And now I'm a really big supporter of my historically black colleges. I wish I had gone to one because of all the experiences I had, but when it was time for me to choose colleges, I didn't really seriously consider them because I didn't think that was going to be the best place for me. I didn't think that I was going to be amongst the best and the brightest because of what I had internalized. Right. And I now know that is completely wrong, and I wish I could go back and have gone to an HBCU. But those are the kinds of things that I thought about, was all the ways that I've had to unlearn all of these things that I was taught, whether people actually said them to me or I just kind of absorbed them, the situations that I was in. And so that's what I think about with internalized racism is the oppressor has made me believe these lies, and now I have to unlearn them. But it's only because I was conscious that these were lies that I'm able to unlearn them. If I had never come to that realization, I might still believe some of these things.
Yeah. I think it's hard with the brutality. I really I don't watch a lot of the things. I actually don't watch the news. I made a decision a long time ago. I read the news instead, because when we watch things and we don't know what's coming next, and it's brutal or it's violent, it's traumatized, you can get re-traumatized. And for, some of the articles I did see out there were sort of cautioning Black Americans about watching yet another video, and also talking about what does it mean to send forward this video and diminish the brutality, and treat it like it's something that you would just pass along, because it really should not be. And there's both the benefit now of having the videotapes, but we've had videotaping for a while now, and it continues, right?
Rodney King.
Yeah.
So what, 1991 to now?
Yeah.
Right? So we're not learning from it. So my question is, it's not just internalized racism with the police force and the idea of the history of policing in the United States, it's institutionalized racism. And after watching the video, it took me a while to have empathy for everyone, because obviously my heart went out to this young man who had this, 29, he's a father. But then I realized, oh, wait a minute, everybody's lives are ruined now. I know nothing about, nor do I honestly really want to know much more about the aggressors in the situation, but they probably did not go onto the force thinking, one day I'm going to do this, that I'll have the authority and the right, and they didn't do that. So now their lives are ruined. They're more likely to be fired because they are Black Americans, so they're more likely to be fired quickly, which they were, and prosecuted. So there's the institutionalized racism within policing, and one of the, and you could talk a lot more, given I did look you up. You have incredible knowledge.
Did you Google him?
Yeah, it could be dangerous.
But you have a lot of knowledge around racial identity, and and so what does it mean, to be Black? What does it mean to be a police officer? Because there's also a blue identity that gets talked about, right? And now if you have these competing identities, and you're having a threat response. So I'm going to defer a little bit more to Alex around talking about some things. I do want people to understand, when you're having a threat response, you are not responding the same way you would in another situation. And when that's gotten lost completely in this situation. Why was this young man considered a threat? He's pulled over for an alleged suspicious or reckless driving. Right? Alleged reckless driving. And it escalated very quickly. So I'll talk a little, that's the piece I think we all have to start understanding around what is the threat, and what are we doing when we're under threat? And then when you throw race and you throw power, like authority, into that, it can go down. It goes downhill really fast. And the only other thing I was thinking too around the gender piece, so when Sandy did the comment for On the Street, I thought of Sandra Bland because of the name similarity, and I thought she was around the same age. She had been pulled over for some alleged, small minor thing, and 3 days later she was gone, and the family continues to have to deal with that, and they try to educate people. They were here at the Woods Home Film Festival a few years ago with the film, and it's just heartbreaking. So like for Tyree's family and for all the police officers, like all the trauma that goes at an interpersonal level, but we still aren't getting to the bottom of institutionally how do we keep the racism and the disproportionate use of lethal force and the disproportionate traffic stops for young Black men. Color of the police officers has increased in terms of diversity on the forces, but that's not necessarily solving the problem.
Because they're operating within that institutionalized racist system.
Yeah.
I would posit, right?
Yeah, I think that's.
But I don't have the credentials that the two of you do. So Alex, what are you
You
thinking?
have the lived credentials.
Well,
And
I've
all
lived it.
the other.
Amen.
Yeah,
Amen.
that I've lived.
Lived
yeah.
experiences are not usually considered credentials, but you're absolutely right, they are.
So I was really struck by your comments about threat. And I was thinking about how the connection between being perceived as a threat based on your skin color and how the institutions then in some way reinforce that idea.
Right.
So I'll give you a simple, not simplistic, but a simple example. Years ago, I was coming across the border with my son. We've been blessed with 3 boys. I was with my middle son. This was years ago. I think he was 6 or so at the time. We went up to Niagara. I was coming back. And as we were waiting to cross the border from Canada into the US, before us, in the car before, there was a family who were white. And the interaction between the family and the border patrol person was very pleasant. There was laughing and joking, and you could kind of feel the energy from the car just looking at it. When we got there, the border patrol was a white male. When we got there, the feeling changed very quickly, and it almost felt like an interrogation. Where have you been? What do you do? Etc. And there was an edge to it. So I as you need to do, of course, I responded respectfully, and then we drove off. What struck me was what my son said. He said to me, "Daddy, why was that man talking to you like that?" Okay. So I said to him, I think he just wants to check to make sure that we are who we are, and it's okay for him to let us back home. So my son said, "But why wouldn't he let us back? This is our home." Okay? So this is a 6-year-old starting to make sense of this whole idea of somehow there's something going on here. There needs to be this double checking to make sure. And so it's about this thread, who people see us, how we make sense of that, and then these messages get reinforced by the institutions. And so I think it's that connection between institutions and personal behavior that makes it very challenging.
It is when you're taught things that we now, I will use myself as an example, now know to be untrue. When you're taught that and then reinforce that all the time. So, what I mentioned growing up, some of the things that I heard, and I don't know if you ever heard this or if you ever heard this, but if you are articulate and you speak well, what do people say? You want to finish that sentence for me?
I'm not sure where you're going.
Okay, all right. Well, what I hear a lot, and I know people in my generation say, "Oh, you speak white. You speak white very well."
Yeah. You talk
In fact,
white.
in
You talk white. Yeah.
In South Africa, it was the same dynamic.
Yeah.
People would say, "Stop trying to be white."
See?
Yeah.
Can I just back up for a second and say how fascinating it is how Black culture can be just across continents, across cultures. There are just some things that just happen to Black people in Black culture. Something like that in South Africa versus Southern California and
North Carolina.
I was going to say Buffalo. I knew that was wrong. I was getting there.
Right,
I was getting there. North Carolina. It just and my husband, who's also from North Carolina, it's amazing how many things that I'll say, well, this happened to you, or like when you went to your grandma's house and you saw this, what was in it? And it's just fascinating. So I feel like that could be a whole nother show conversation. My point is, so when I did go off to college and I was at a predominantly white institution and I was an engineer, which means I was also a minority.
Oh, that's really white.
It's really white. Yeah, and it's really male dominated. The ratio of men to women at my school was 7-1. It's 6-1 now, they boast, but it's 7-1. And I remember I had a professor and I was struggling in his class, aircraft dynamics, because that was hard. And I went to his office and he said, "Well, people like you generally just don't do well in my class." And it brought up all the things that I felt like I had learned over the years of like, you're not good enough and you're not smart enough. And yeah, I failed his class and I had to retake it with somebody else because I didn't feel like I could go to his office after that and ask him for help, and there weren't specific tutors for that. So anyway, my point is that when you have those, when you're taught certain things and when you have these beliefs, whether they're true or not, then the systems, the institutions in place reinforce that. It's really difficult to come from underneath that and to learn that that's wrong and then to move past that even. So it's one thing to recognize that's wrong. Then it's another thing to say, this is wrong, and what am I going to do about it? What am I going to learn to do and be different?
This is reminding me, I think I've told this story before on the conversation. When I was admitted to the University of North Carolina, my father was summoned to the admissions office with me. And I was admitted as a probationary student, right? And I'll never forget the assistant director of admissions said to my father, Mr. Mebane, now when your son flunks out, not if your son flunks out or should your son flunk out, when Will flunks out, don't be surprised, you know. And my father said, well, why would you say that? And he says, well, at that point, 70% of black students entering the University of North Carolina flunked out. So the projection was on to me, just based on skin color, maybe my academic record as well, I'll give them that, which wasn't stellar, at least not to their standards. The presumption was that I was not going to be able to make it, right? And I remember driving home from Chapel Hill to Durham, North Carolina, and my father didn't say a word in the car the whole 8-mile drive, right? But I knew what he was thinking, which was, you better not,
you best not
flunk out. You are not going to live into their expectations. You have your own expectations. And so I think about what you were saying, Angie, about how, you know, I could have internalized that and gone there and said, well, I'm not going to succeed anyway, so let me have fun, you know, while I can and enjoy campus life. But instead, I was a Dean's List student first semester. I was Dean's List the second semester. Sophomore year, I played around. I had to get back on. You know.
But you started off strong.
I finished strong, you know. Right. But yeah, there's this, and I feel like I'm doing too much of the talking, so I'm just saying it's also in my vocation as a priest in the Episcopal Church. You know, I don't wear my collar as much as I used to, but when I started out, I said, you know, I gotta wear my collar because people aren't used to seeing a black priest.
Representation matters.
You know, how many black Episcopal priests do you know? Right. So to try to counter that indoctrination that you can't be, right, I wore it more to try to be a quote role model or model in some way. But Donna, what are you thinking as we continue here?
Well, I think I'm glad we're having the conversation, but the other phrase of when black parents have to have the conversation with their kids, right? The conversation, because if we do look at what happened with Tyre Nichols and then having 5 black police officers, if all those kids, at some point, their parents said, if you ever get pulled over by the cops, particularly because if you're young and you're black and you're a male, you're in trouble. But you don't have a lot of options. So when you're under threat, so the police experience a threat too. So that's the problem. Both people have the potential to be in threat, right? The police it is dangerous for them to do a stop and detain, but they're supposed to be trained to do it a certain way to keep them safe and to follow what the legal options are under those circumstances. And so when both parties go into threat mode, though, all bets are off because you're actually now, your amygdala is on fire and you are going to have several options: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And that's it. Both parties. If once they're in threat mode, they're both going to do that. Yeah. And if you throw in implicit bias and racism and different competing stereotypes, it's not going to go well. And if people can't recognize they're entering into that potential situation, I'm entering into a situation where I might have bias at play. I'm entering into a situation where I'm going to have a threat response, and then I'm not going to think as clearly under those circumstances. But, you know, the reality is it's a high-risk situation then. If you get pulled over and your rights aren't being, your rights aren't going to be followed. That's what happened to Sandra Bland. Her rights were just violated.
Yeah.
So it's not just about, if you get pulled over and the person next to you is treating you with a racial stereotype that you can't do much about because they have the power. It's that they also can become aggressive and violent, and you will not have. It doesn't. Tyree Nichols tried to do. I don't watch a lot of these things. It's hard. It replays in my head. That's partly why I don't watch the videos. He did every single thing he could to get out of that, and he still couldn't get out of it.
Right.
So, and what made 5 men see him as a threat? 5 armed men see this, young man as a threat, and continue to do what they did. And then the 2 EMTs arrived on site and didn't provide care. So it's again around the disregard that the person it's just a level of disregard for another human being. It goes a little beyond, it's a power dynamic at that point around who is going to be able to determine the outcome of this interaction. And so gender does play a role, because you do have aggression, right? And men in general, violent crimes, lethal force by police, all tend to be more male, occur with men. We don't have enough women on the force maybe to compare it, but I kind of, in the policing and how we talk about policing, because that gets things really stirred up politically in the country, right? Along political lines too. So again, I'm concerned that we're not having the next level of the conversation around, internalized racism is important, institutional racism is important, but we keep allowing violence and aggression to happen with a lawsuit. It doesn't do anything. A videotape's not doing anything. Like, why is the aggression continuing to be somehow permitted?
So that's a big question. I wouldn't dare to jump into that question, other than to say that we should not be surprised. Yeah. So the foundation of our country is genocide and enslavement. Incredibly violent means. And so I get cautious when people say, let's think about these, without realizing that this is just an extension of what has always been. So where do we start? Where do we intervene? We tend to let's do a program to work on police bias, and but we need to pull back and how does violence get played out in our society in general? So that's the one thought. The other thought I have in regard to your discussion about police violence threat is some of the work that I'm doing with Robert Carter and other colleagues on racial trauma. And I'll share with you how pervasive this is. So I'm driving down from Boston.
Oh no.
Driving down from Boston, 1993, I forget the names of in the hour and 20-minute trip, I only see one car that's been pulled over by the state troopers. And it just so happens that the 2 occupants that are pulled over are 2 young black men. No, I've got no sense of, but that's what I see. What is striking for me is where that takes my mind. Okay? So all of a sudden I'm thinking, so what does that mean? Did they do anything? Are they going to be safe? And then it takes me to experiences where I've been stopped and I've been literally shaking, not knowing if I'm going to see my family, knowing I've done nothing wrong. And so so that's trauma.
Yeah.
That is trauma. Now you might say it's kind of low-level trauma, but imagine that playing out day by day, year by year. And so that's some of the work we're trying to understand. And it's pervasive. And at the heart of trauma is a sense of not being safe. So that's where some of my thoughts took me as I was listening and hearing, your musings on violence, gender, police brutality. It feels overwhelming.
So let me ask a question, if I can, about the trauma that you're referring to. So Donna, you mentioned not watching the videos, and I know I've struggled with this, and I think we've talked about this on the show at some point, about the juxtaposition, I guess, I feel about these videos. On one hand, I don't want to watch them. I don't want to relive the trauma. I have my own traumas. I don't need to see it to understand it. Then part of me feels like I owe it to this person who has lost their life to understand what happened to them. And I wrestle with that. So Tyree, I haven't seen that video, and there's other ones that I've seen enough that I play them in my head often. And so I kind of wonder, watching those videos and reliving that trauma, what is that doing to me? If there's even an answer to that. Should I be viewing that? And in your opinion, I don't know if I'm quite asking the right question, but it's something that I know I wrestle with. And I'd like your opinion on it.
What are your thoughts, Donna?
I think it's good to wrestle with it, because each time you do watch a video, it's not a video, it's real, it's not a movie, you run the risk of being re-traumatized. So you have to know where you're at with your own stress level, with your own history of trauma, and there's a way to honor someone lost their life without necessarily having to view the video. But there are times when maybe, this I did feel like I needed to bear witness, because I did need to understand. I didn't want to just read someone's report about what happened. I only watched one of the videotapes, because there are several. But I do think it's important, if you're going to be trying to figure, because it is overwhelming to think about how do we address trauma, how do we start to make some changes so people feel safe. They feel like everyone belongs in our country. This is our home. Like, we are a country built on slavery, and now we're all here living together, and we don't know how to talk about it. We are not still treating each other fairly or equally. And so I think we have to be careful about how much we get the trauma takes, because it can get to a point where you're not going to be coping as well. Yeah. So I think you do have to protect yourself, and then continue to try to do what you can, in your life, in your community, in larger settings if you can. But I think you have to be careful about trauma. It does, it's hard to recover from multiple traumas. Each time you get traumatized, and there's little T traumas and then big T traumas. So, big T trauma would be abuse, a risk of your death, and violence. But little T traumas are all the little everyday things that you go through, getting pulled over, being, in that moment afraid, and someone yelling, something at you is a little T trauma, and they are cumulative. So I would say, if you know yourself and know how to, maybe find support, find ways to just take care of yourself, physically, mentally, emotionally.
Thank you. What are your thoughts, Alex?
So this is something that I struggle with. So personally, I choose not to watch it. For me, it does nothing other than stir up feelings. But I wouldn't say to people, don't watch it. I would say, make a choice, understand why you are watching it, and be attentive to the emotions that it does produce. And so know what's driving you, the meaning associated with you watching it, and then understand that it is going to have some impact. So that's how I think of it. The tricky piece is I'm thinking of some of the really iconic pictures that came out of Jim Crow, even before, pictures of folk being lynched. Those are so difficult to see, and at the same time they have some utility, a broad attention. So I get that, but for me personally, I choose not to. And then I think about how can I honor, because I think in watching, sometimes we do watch in an attempt to honor the life of the person. I'm thinking, what other ways can I honor that life that was taken?
Yeah.
But I, for me personally, I don't. 2 or 3 years ago, I think a young Hispanic or Latino boy was shot in Chicago, who was 13. I remember this clearly. I think it was a Wednesday or Thursday. My wife, our youngest son, who was 11 at the time, and I were at home. And typically we don't watch the news together as a family. For some reason it was on and they mentioned this. Our 11-year-old son started weeping, just started weeping. I had no words.
Yeah.
The only thing I can do in that moment was holding. He didn't need to see it.
Yeah.
So I would not say don't watch it, but I would say be attentive, be intentional, and understand that this is going to be impactful. It's going to have some impact.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your thoughts on that. Thank you.
I do watch it. What does that make me, a masochist or sadist or what is it? What are those?
Oh no.
But what I worry about is the desensitization, right? That there's so much of it that, it's just, and the cumulative effect, that it's just become that's just the way it is. That's just what happens. There's another one, right? And so that bothers me. I think there's so much of it that's broadcast that does create this sort of desensitization. And I was been thinking about this following the shootings in Nashville of the 3 children and the 9-year-olds and the faculty and staff that were killed in this latest mass shooting. And I'm thinking about what you said, Alex, about violence in this country. And people keep wrestling with, why don't we do anything about it? Why aren't we doing anything to stop this? Because we are a violent nation.
Yeah.
That's why we don't do anything about it. It's part of our core. It's in our DNA. This country was founded on violence. It loves guns. It loves death and destruction. And it would take, I don't know what it would take.
I don't either.
Someone with better skills than I have, and probably a cadre of good folks like you all to try to, is that the psyche? To try to change the psyche of how we, so, yeah.
Your comment is so interesting and powerful because violence is the norm in our country.
It is.
Across the board. Violence directed at people of color. It's the norm. And so when we had this shooting that occurred just 2 days ago, yesterday I had a class, got a lovely class, undergrad students, and the focus of the class is on structural impediments to healthy development amongst children and adolescents. And so we were talking about school violence. And we had the sense of, when did this become normal? And so on one hand it's normal, but on the other hand it's not normal.
Yeah.
It is not normal. This goes against the experience of being a human. But it's so normal in our society, and I'm saying to the students, and we're talking together, what can we do to make sure that it doesn't become normal for us?
Right.
It's normal, but it's not acceptable.
No.
But it's also not normal.
And it's not normal in other, quote, developed countries, right? This is a uniquely American phenomenon, right?
Yes.
But that takes me back to our founding and the violence that is at the core of our founding. We probably should move to the next question.
We probably should. Thank you so much for that. All right. So we will move on to our next question now, which is, how do you overcome internalized racism, or do you just live with it? So let's hear what Sandy had to say about that.
I think it's very difficult. I'm not sure that there's much you can do. I mean, you can get therapy, or you can have a stiff upper lip, but when you're re-traumatized, it continues to endure. I think that if in many communities, it's a transgenerational crisis. Native Americans, African Americans, Jews have histories that are very painful in our country and in our world, and I think they probably continue to be re-traumatized through the media, through news, through episodes of racism, anti-Semitism, whatever that happen in our communities. These are events that would re-traumatize.
So we're now moving on, kind of, in the discussion to talk about internalized racism and what do we do about it. And I'd like to start with you, Alex. What do you think about what Sandy had to say and what we do about it?
I've got a lot of thoughts.
Please, we've got all day.
So I'll try to keep them limited. So I've got a couple of thoughts. So we do know, based on research, that there are strategies or interventions that families, parents can bring that can kind of shift the way people see themselves. And so I'm thinking there's a fairly large body of literature on racial socialization, and that's really, and it's in the context of family development. And so the idea is that, and a lot of this has been done with black families, that parents or guardians or caregivers can kind of counter the messages that are provided to young people about who they are according to their racial group membership. And part of the countering is teaching cultural history, facilitating racial identity development, also teaching our young people how to be prepared for racial discrimination, recognizing that when something happens to you, it's not because you've done something, but it's something that's happening to you. And so ways in which you can protect the self. So there's that level. And then there's also kind of the larger societal level. You know? And I think this goes to, we were talking in the break about some of Sandy's comments about the transgenerational transmission of trauma and also crisis. You know, so often communities of color are seen to experience crisis or be in crisis, and we tend to understand that in the context of our history. Okay? And that narrative, I think, also feeds this idea of internalized racism. And so I think on a societal level, it's important to recognize that narrative, but also to know that there is another narrative. There's another narrative. You know, we are not only our trauma. There are ways in which people of color have contributed to this country enormously. Right. But the narrative that we are given, and then through internalized racism, I think sometimes carry, is this narrative of trauma and crisis. Right. Yeah. But there is another narrative, and I think teaching the other narrative is one way to counter internalized racial oppression.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think about movies often. And I've said, I'm not watching another slave movie. I can't do it. Like there are so many movies about us and our trauma. And yes, it's important to tell those stories, but a lot of times they're just movies. They're romanticized in many ways. And so we're not really talking about the brutality of it. We're not talking about chattel slavery when we're showing these films. But also, there's a lot more to black people than just slavery, right? There's a whole continent of black people we could make movies about, right? There's a whole United States of black people like we could make movies about. And then sometimes we do make movies that have the white savior tropes that are in them, which is a whole rabbit hole I won't go into today. But you know, there is another narrative that we don't often ever talk about. You have to go find it if you want to talk about it. Excuse me. I know you were gonna say something.
Well, oh gosh, you know, I want to ask the two of you, Donna and Alex. Help us understand, and our viewers understand how, as I understand it, the most recent DSM manuals for coding clinical disorders or behaviors and what have you.
Yeah, I don't know what he's talking about, so you have to explain that.
Has said that racism is a contributor to a cause of PTSD in black folks. So can you just, am I reading that right? Am I hearing that correctly? What's happening in the medical field around?
So, I'm not always a huge fan of the DSM.
Okay.
What is
So
the
the DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that you, for insurance purposes, you have to diagnose people. It has a number, letter code, and that's how, it's also how you get reimbursed from insurance, but it's also then how you decide on a decision tree when someone comes in based on their symptoms. You have to describe in a shorthand to other people, what do you think they're dealing with?
Oh, well, if insurance is involved, then it's probably whatever. Anyway.
But the problem I have with that, a lot of times, is how it reduces things. It's very reductionistic, and it doesn't put the person in context. So, PTSD, when you're looking at someone who has trauma, based on what kind of trauma, and if they meet the criteria. So there's a checklist that you would say, do they meet the criteria for PTSD according to this checklist? So if you're living in a society where you're dealing with more trauma based on your race, gender, age, you're going to have more cumulative trauma, or if you ancestrally intergenerational trauma, which we know is real. There's research. It also affects your physical health. It doesn't just affect your mental health. You're more likely to have high blood pressure. You're more likely to have a lot of, the risk is more the level of stress that you live with on a daily basis. And then if you do have trauma that has been life-threatening and you develop PTSD, or there's another category called acute stress response. There's nothing in there really for intergenerational transmission of trauma, or for even day-to-day small, traumas that people deal with. I think interracial and generational trauma is, it goes, when you start to think about race, white people don't get a pass because race is something, it's a social construct, right? So you have to include your own race in that. It's not just Black Americans that are living with, how white Americans are not dealing with race, and how that then is disproportionate. They don't, so Janet Helms, who had been at BU, did the racial identity model. And so how you think about your own racial identity, how you think about your family and what came before you, what my concern is, it's not, until we think of this as a problem for us to figure out together and how we talk about it, and that brings me back to when I looked at what happened with Tyre Nichols, and there wasn't a lot of coverage because people are afraid to talk about what's happening. You can't reduce it just to the 5 police officers were Black and Tyre Nichols was Black. We're missing the whole point then. So does it mean internalized racism was a part of what happened? Yes, but what it means was, the structural racism, in order for us to do something about that, the police force, what's happening now with the police versus the history of the police, and not talking about the police were developed to keep slaves from running away.
Please say that again. Please tell folks that.
But when we talk about our history, we can't even talk about that history without it becoming people getting upset and it becoming divisive.
Right.
And that's white Americans dealing with their race. Why are white Americans threatened by a historical document that says the first grouping of law enforcement was to deal with runaway slaves? Why is that a threat to any white American living today? That shouldn't be a threat. We're back to threat again. See, threat's not a real, it's a perceived threat. So something about talking about that creates a threat response. People get defensive. Guilt, defensive. overwhelmed, so they shut down. So as soon as you go into a threat response, your frontal lobes go offline. You are no longer able to be present in terms of thinking, responding, because your threat response is in your limbic system. Your amygdala lights up, and you have 4 choices: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And until you...
What's the fourth one?
Fawn.
Like a baby deer?
Yeah, so that's the image they use, but it has to do with you try to be likable, you try to make sure the other person doesn't perceive you as a threat.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, so you try to do things like, oh, I'm not a threat to you, like, or I'm going to help you so that you can't get upset with
Look
me.
at me, I'm a cute little fawn,
Yeah.
like I'm not a threat.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm not a threat. You know, and that's how a lot of kids do survive childhood trauma, right? They can't freeze all the time. Some kids fight, some kids flee, but a lot of kids survive by like, I'm not going to be, and that's a harder one to undo as they get older, and kind of puts them at further risk if they keep trying to please people, or they only, in order to get their needs met, they have to worry about whether or not someone else's emotional state is where that is. So, but I do think like we can't even have the conversation. Like we're not even at the point where we can say, why can't we talk about what happened, you know, without everybody getting worked up and going into a threat response, like and yelling or, you know, it's not about being right anymore. It's about we've accepted aggression is normal. We're accepting that people are continue to be treated differently when they get pulled over for a minor traffic violation.
My mentor, Robert Carter, used to say, how is it that black folk and other folk of color end up talking so much about race when we aren't the ones who invented it?
Great question.
You know, the white folk actually have more expertise because they invented it. But I think you know, if we really have discussions, it means that change has to occur. And that's part of what keeps us from having discussions. I think I want to go back to your comment or your question on PTSD, which can open up a whole large discussion about race and mental illness and the function of professional psychology. So PTSD and racism is a really useful illustration. If you look at the current DSM-5, race-related trauma is actually not part of the criteria for PTSD. So the criteria is based on the threat and then the accompanying kind of responses, both physical and psychological. And a specific racial threat is not listed as a potential threat for PTSD criteria. And so there are a couple of ways we can think about that. One is that the history of mental health, like professional mental health in our country, has often excluded the experience of people of color or pathologized what are kind of normal responses. So the most famous example is Samuel Cartwright in South Carolina, I think in the 1840s or 1850s, introduced a new diagnostic classification that was applied to enslaved Africans. The title of the disease was called drapetomania. And the disease was the kind of obsessive attempt of enslaved folk to run away.
Oh, wow.
This is, I'm not making this stuff up.
I believe you are.
So the classification was called drapetomania, and the treatment, amongst others, was a good whipping. Okay? So this was part of mental health treatment in that part of the country in the day. So in some ways, even our professional ways of treating mental health has either excluded the experiences of people of color or have pathologized our responses. So the work I'm doing now also with my mentor, Robert Carter, is in a sense rethinking the impact of racism-related trauma, and we're actually questioning if PTSD is the best way to think about it. So we think of mental illness as a kind of intrapsychic process, you know? But racism is something that's happening to you, which is the same with many other traumas. You know, so something happens to you, you have an emotional response which is appropriate, why should that response be labeled psychopathology? You know, anger is a very appropriate response. Sadness, being vigilant. So there's a lot of really interesting discussion and thinking around that. But I think the point I really wanted to emphasize, partly because the viewers might not know some of the history of mental health treatment in this country, is that mental health care, like many other systems in our country, in some way is designed to exclude the experiences of people of color. Or so, and I think that's an important point to think about.
It makes sense when you actually do think about it, because a lot of our medical systems, institutions do that, exclude people of color. We're built off of using people of color for medical advancement. Experimentation is a much better word for that. So I hadn't considered mental health being in that, but that absolutely makes sense. Why would mental health be left out of all of the other things that Black people and people of color were used to experiment on, or to? Yeah, it does make sense, but I'd never thought about it.
So what do we do? How do we?
Because you talked about, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
You did talk about children and making sure what about somebody like me who went through their childhood?
There's no hope for you.
Thanks, Rev.
Not even Donna's treatment could take care of it.
So what about someone who's a young adult, somebody who unfortunately didn't have a lot of, and I'm not necessarily talking about me, but I'm talking about somebody who didn't necessarily have a lot of encouragement, or didn't have someone show them imagery of Black people or people of color in a positive light. And then you get to the stage where you're in college, or you're an adult, and then you have an experience that makes you realize, like, oh, maybe I should actually come to terms with who I am as a person of color. Yeah, and what do you do at that point when you realize that I've internalized all of this racism and I can't continue to live like this? Like, I've seen the light. Then what do you do? I guess I'll let you in on that too.
You move to Canada. No.
There's so many amazing authors, and the access to information, the internet can cut both ways, but like, you really can find people that are talking about something at the level that you're at, that you can engage with it, right? And that there's just a lot of organizations and groups now that really are available, that just you kind of have to find them, you have to look. But I do think some of it is just realizing you're not alone. B, this is a much bigger problem than you. It's not an intrapsychic problem. It's not even just an interpersonal problem. Yeah. It is a big problem. All of us have to figure out how we can show up and do our part. And that's all we can do. But we do want to show up and do it in a way where we have a level of self-awareness, right? And take care of ourselves. Like, if there is exposure to trauma, if you already have a history of trauma, and then you need to be, aware of what that means for you, and how to, take care of yourself as you move forward with figuring out what to do about internalized racism. But you have to do it. Like, you in terms of what makes change. I heard it was a joke about psychologists, but people only change when they have to, they want to, or, have you heard this?
No.
They have to, they want to.
Oh, they're paying for it?
There's a third one. But no, there's all this stuff, but really psychology and a lot of things is about change. But when they're ready, right? Oh. So when they're ready. So when they're ready, so the timing might not be right for some people, right? And I really do, there's a huge movement out now there on self-compassion, but I think compassion in general is going to be the only way we're gonna undo the violence. And now when people think about change, if people are coming at it from a deficit model or from a scarcity model, change is always gonna be a threat. We're back to threat. If we can have the conversation where we're gonna change, but people can stay in place where there's not a threat. We can talk about change without there being a threat. We can engage with each other with amount of compassion. Now I'm going to tell you, when the Tyre Nichols case, after watching that video, it took me weeks before I could come up with any compassion for those police officers, right? But that had to be part of it. Like, I had to get there to realize they didn't go, I don't think they were sociopaths. They were not going into the police force intending to cause someone harm. So we have to expand how we think of what it means to be human together. That normal, what we've accepted as normal, that's the part that's the problem. That slavery was ever a way of establishing a country. Genocide to Native Americans. That's how we established our country. So, but now here we are, and we still are accepting violence and aggression and racism, and so I don't, you know, race, how we talk about race, how we compassionately show up for each other. I mean, I have to have some hope, you know. I don't delude myself, but.
No, but I agree with that. Given my vocation, you know, I have to have hope in the human. You know, my belief is that we were all, each of us created. None of us were created with hatred in our hearts. We weren't created with being racist or misogynist or sexist or any of those things. Those are all learned behaviors. We learn those things, or maybe, well, I guess that's all indoctrination from society. But let me ask you this, as sort of my closing question. Is this internalized racism, is this a uniquely American problem?
This, I would say the simple answer is no.
Okay.
So, and I'll tell you why I'm saying that with such confidence. So over my academic career, I've started to shift my understanding of what I study. I've always studied race and racism, but I've come to appreciate more and more that what I'm studying is power. So I'm studying power dynamics, and the place in which it's being played out. My area of interest is race. But I think that power dynamics often are similar across different domains. You know, so the power that plays out in race, white, you know, assumed white superiority, assigned inferiority to people of color, that gets played out in other domains, gender, it might get played out in sexual orientation. So for example, the literature that looks at internalized homophobia, you know, a similar type of dynamic where you are internalizing what you've been taught about yourself. So in that sense, I think it's more of a kind of human experience based on systems of oppression.
Yeah.
We do it pretty well in this country. We excel in how we do it in this country, but I think it's not unique to our experience. You know? So I, to this day, I think I'm a developed, mature adult. To this day, I will catch myself, after all of these years, having a thought about myself based on who I am racially, and sometimes those thoughts are negative.
Yeah.
And then I have this thought of, I thought I worked through all of that, you know? But it catches me. And then I'm thinking, well, I was taught this as a child. It was ingrained to me. But it can be unlearned. It can be unlearned.
And I think we also need to make it known that there's always room for growth.
Yes.
Right? Is that you're never gonna learn it all. I often think about the show we had in November of 2020.
Yes.
We were thinking about show topics. The show was still relatively new. And I brilliantly said, well, it's November, let's talk about Native American history, because it's November. And we had a great discussion. At the end of our discussion, a wonderful Indigenous woman says, well, you know, we always get asked to do stuff in November. We're here the rest of the year too. And I thought, I can't say words that I thought, but I thought, oh,
We're doing the same thing that other
we are
people
doing the
do.
thing right now, and we had to give ourselves some grace about that and say
Yeah.
that we are also learning and still working on that. And I think about that so often, more often than I probably should admit. But I think about it often because it was such a good reminder that this is we live these lives as two of us as Black people, and we do this work in this community, and you've definitely done it elsewhere. And yet there is still going to be some work to do, still some unlearning to do.
Donna, I hope you're not planning on hanging up your shingle anytime soon, because there's a lot of work available for you.
There is.
Yeah,
Actually, there's a couple committees I think I'm going to talk to you about. Since you're here and you can't escape me.
Yeah. I mean, these are the conversations, honestly, and I do think sensitive, empathic people are the ones who are going to maybe, you have to stay in the game. You can't have the trauma. You got to face it, deal with it, get the support. But if you get overwhelmed, we all lose. Like, you got to keep coming back and saying, I'm going to go and, I don't really like talking in front of people, but you got to show up.
Yeah.
And you got to have the conversation. And texting is not going to do it. These little small sound bites that we are relying on a lot. We have to take time, and we have to be with, I think, each other in person. And hopefully, I do think, we're a young country. Our form of government is young. We have a history of trauma and oppression, and we clearly have a long way to go, but we could figure it out. I mean, that's also a possibility, right? We could also figure it out. We're not doing it right now, but if we stop doing it, we'll never figure it out.
Oh, I think we have to figure it out, Donna.
Yeah.
We have no choice. The racial trauma is unlike other traumas. It robs us of our humanity. I think that's what trauma does. It steals your sense of safety. You become hypervigilant. You become distrustful. It robs us of our humanity. If that's happening to us at an individual, at a community, it's happening to us in our country. And we have to. We have no choice. We have to figure it out, because our survival, I think, is at stake. I don't mean to sound melodramatic but I really believe that we can. We can.
We can. And I do think what has to happen, and maybe it's a critical mass issue, because now we're back to change, and change can't be perceived as a threat of I'm going to lose if I change, right? So maybe it takes enough people, right? You keep adding a few more people, but not the same people, right?
Yeah.
Who've done the work and keep doing the work. There's a few new people in there, yeah. But yeah, I think hopefully we get enough. We can do it happen.
Yeah, we got to keep hope alive, right? Right?
But
Isn't that your job to help us keep hope alive?
I'm doing my best to do help in some small way. Donna Jackson, clinical psychologist, and Alex Pieterse,
Pieterse, that's right.
professor at Boston College and doing great research in this field. We thank you very much for helping us have the conversation around this subject of internalized racism. And Angie, I love you.
I love you too, Rev.
Always great to be with
It's
you.
wonderful to see you and be with you. You're awesome.
I know.
You all have been awesome as well. Thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you for having me. Really,
thank you to our viewers for continuing to watch the conversation, and hopefully continue these conversations and more in your workplace, at dinner tables, and amongst your family and friends. So until next time, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.